To the first session of the Psychology, Writing, Rhetoric, and Digital Studies presentations. Just a few housekeeping reminders. This presentation is being recorded, and questions are definitely encouraged by other students, panelists, and attendees. Please ask your questions through the Q&A feature that's located in your toolbar, as we have disabled the raise your hand. Okay. Oops. So our first presenter will be Eliot Bradshaw, who works under the supervision of Jonathan Golding in the Department of Psychology. Eliot, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I will stop sharing mine and you can share.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eliot Bradshaw, and I work under Dr. Jonathan Golding, like she just said. And today I will be presenting my research on the influence of defendant tattoo placement and style on jury decision-making. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the wrong presentation. Let me get the right one. I'm presenting twice today.
No pressure.
And it just keeps going to that one. I'm sorry, this worked earlier.
Take your time, Eliot, because we'll start your 10 minutes when you get it up, okay?
Okay.
We understand technical difficulty.
All too well.
Okay, this is the right one. So like I said, my name is Eliot Bradshaw and I work under Dr. Jonathan Golding. And today I will be sharing the influence of Rohypnol on legal decision-making. So sexual assault and rape are big issues, especially on college campuses. And one factor that is implicated in a lot of these cases is the impairment due to drugs or alcohol. One of the drugs most commonly cited in these cases is Rohypnol, which is a date rape drug. And Rohypnol is essentially a powerful tranquilizer, and it puts the victims in a state of paralysis, which renders them incapable of consent. And in rape cases, this inability to consent is especially interesting. And so it's really important to consider this in the realm of jury decision-making. The purpose of this present study is to determine the influence of positive and negative influence of Rohypnol on legal decision-making. Only 2 previous studies have examined the impact of Rohypnol on decision-making, and both of them found that negative evidence or Rohypnol not being present in the victim's bloodstream led to greater leniency in sentencing and more positive feelings towards the defendant. The current study has 3 hypotheses. We predicted a main effect of evidence, so that participants who read about evidence of ingesting Rohypnol would have higher pro-victim ratings and guilty verdicts than when there was no evidence. A main effect of gender. Female participants should have higher pro-victim ratings and guilty verdicts than males. And victim credibility ratings should be mediated, or the relationship between evidence and verdict should be mediated by victim credibility ratings, so that evidence of Rohypnol would lead to higher ratings of victim credibility, which would lead to more guilty verdicts. We recruited our participants through Amazon's Mechanical Turk, and we ended up with 58 females, 59 males, for a total of 117 participants. This was a 3x2 between participants design, with the 3 levels of evidence of Rohypnol being yes, there was positive evidence, no, there was negative evidence, or the victim wasn't tested. And the 2 levels of participant gender were male and female. Participants were randomly assigned to a condition, and they read a mock criminal trial rape summary. And then they responded to a questionnaire, which had questions about the responsibility, credibility, in memory of both the defendant and the victim, and then their anger and sympathy towards each. And finally, they were asked to render their verdict. As you can see in figure 1, our first hypothesis was supported. There was a main effect of evidence, so that there were more guilty verdicts when there was evidence of ingesting Rohypnol than when there was no evidence or negative evidence. As you can see in figure 2, hypothesis 2 was also supported. There was a significant main effect of participant gender, so that female participants had higher pro-victim and guilty ratings than male participants. Finally, our mediation analysis was also significant. The victim credibility ratings mediated the relationship between evidence of Rohypnol and verdict, and evidence of Rohypnol led to higher victim credibility and more guilty verdicts. So our study did support all of our hypotheses, and it also corroborated the 2 previous studies that had been done. It must be kept in mind, like any study, there were limitations, and one of those is that there was no jury deliberation. In a real life jury, the members would deliberate before rendering their verdict, and so that means that the external validity of the study is not perfect. And also there were many incomplete or incorrect responses in our survey, which took the number of data points we had available from 398 original responses to only 117. So in addition to dealing with these limitations, since this is a relatively new area of study, there are many avenues people could go in the future. One of those is investigating the influence of Rohypnol on jury decision-making as compared to alcohol. Both of those substances can render victims incapable of consent, but since alcohol is willingly consumed, there could be a difference between those. Investigating the influence of relationship between the victim and perpetrator. It's known that most rapes and sexual assaults are committed by someone the victim knows, and so it'd be interesting to manipulate whether the defendant is an acquaintance or a stranger. And investigating the influence of victim gender or sexual orientation on jury decision-making. And that is it for my presentation. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will open it up to any questions you all may have. I have one question. Why do you think the rate of complete responses was so low? This study was actually one that I did with a summer research grant, and it was originally a different design, but we had so many bots kind of take the survey that we didn't have enough usable data, so we switched it to this design. I don't know if it was still the bots, but that is definitely an interesting question, and I can look into it for you. It doesn't look like I can access the Q&A feature to read the question.
Hey, Eliot, try the chat room.
I can get into the chat room, but it looks like I have a question under Q&A. I'm not sure if it's showing up for anyone else.
Okay, well, it was my question, so I'll just verbally ask. Will you be continuing in this research?
I do not have plans to right now, but it is definitely something I would be very interested in doing.
Sure. Okay. Well, listen, this was a great presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So. Okay, oops. Hmm. Well, are you guys seeing, what screen are you seeing? Are you seeing Eliot's or are you seeing a bunch of, are you seeing anything?
Zoom boxes.
Huh, Zoom boxes, okay. Let me see, how about now? Are you seeing Eliot's?
No, we're seeing your email, I think.
Oh, geez. Okay, we'll stop that. Let me see. Of course, see Eliot, technical difficulty, as always. Let me go back here and see.
There was a question on, while we're waiting, Turk and ethics.
Oh, yes.
I will go ahead and answer that. I hadn't actually heard of any criticism of Mechanical Turk. And I think you'll find that all of us here presenting today actually use it since we're all in the same lab. That would be something that I will look into now that I'm aware of it, though.
Okay. So now which one are you seeing? Are you still seeing?
We're still in Zoom boxes.
Oh, man. Okay. Of course, we did 3 dry runs and it worked perfectly. And now
Those were the dry runs, Abby.
I know. Let me see if I can do it this way.
So you're all in the same class?
Yes, I think we are all in Dr. Golding's lab.
Goodness sakes. Sorry, guys. Bear with me.
How did you meet this year? Did you have class in person or over Zoom?
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
So yeah, to kind of collaborate virtually with each other and help each other with our project.
Oh, so you're all friends. That makes this nicer.
Okay. Are you still seeing the squares?
Mhm.
The Zoom boxes? Honest to goodness.
Now we have your email. And now we're back to Zoom boxes.
Okay. Well, I think I will just, let me see if I can do it this way. Okay. I'm not understanding why this is not working. If you all will bear with, I'm going to try this one more time, and if this doesn't work, I'm going to have to seek some help. Okay, bear with me one moment.
So tell us more about this Turk platform. I'm in humanities-based research, and so this isn't something we've used.
So Mechanical Turk is through Amazon. and it recruits participants and pays them a small amount to complete the surveys. I think Kegel said something that there are articles out there on the issue and that there are some problems working through Amazon, which argue it's exploits the survey takers. So that is definitely something interesting to look into. But it does kind of pay them for their time.
Now, how does that work for, do we pay Amazon for it, or is it just through Amazon paying them?
I am not sure of the exact mechanics behind all of it. Someone else may have a better answer for that.
Okay, I'm sure we'll cover it. It looks like we're up.
Yes, so you can see Haley.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, Haley, are you ready to screen share?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Haley Hintz, and I'm a third-year student studying psychology and political science. This research was conducted alongside of Dr. Jonathan Golding in his psychology and law laboratory and is entitled Juror Perceptions of Heterosexual and Same-Sex Spousal Rape in the Courtroom, and it is also a part of my Lewis Honors College senior thesis. Before I begin, I would like to provide everyone with a content warning, as this presentation will discuss sensitive topics surrounding sexual violence. To begin, spousal rape is a nationwide crisis, although its severity often goes unnoticed. Approximately 10 to 15% of American women will be raped by a spouse in their lifetime. In recent years, there's been an increase in research investigating intimate partner violence, of which spousal rape is a subtype, specifically with the emergence of social movements illuminating the prevalence of sexual assault. But this has typically focused on heterosexual relationships and has not been studied within the context of marriage extensively. Therefore, it has been noted that there is an academic silence regarding the study of spousal rape, especially in the context of same-sex couples, despite a higher likelihood of LGBT individuals to experience severe or prolonged intimate partner violence. Research on attitudes towards spousal rape has previously shown that it is not perceived as a serious issue by jurors, and past mock juror research has found that only 4% of men and 13% of women found a defendant guilty of spousal rape in a heterosexual context. This is mostly because people view spousal rape as something that is wrong, but technically does not count within the legal definition of rape. Additionally, political orientation impacts judgment, such that 94% of Democrats have indicated that sexual violence is a serious issue in the United States today, as compared to only 54% of Republicans who agreed with the same statement. Therefore, the purpose of this study is to investigate perceptions of spousal rape in heterosexual and same-sex couples in the courtroom, and we had two hypotheses. First, consistent with research investigating sexual assault in the courtroom, we predicted a main effect of participant gender in that females will be more pro-victim. For example, they'll render more guilty verdicts than males. Second, based on previous research correlating political ideology to beliefs about sexual crime, I predicted a main effect on political orientation, such that liberal-leaning participants will also hold more pro-victim attitudes, for example, rating the victim as more moral, compared to conservative-leaning participants who will be more likely to render more pro-defendant judgments. Because this is the first known research investigating perceptions of same-sex spousal rape, we conducted an exploratory analysis to investigate the impact of interactions between victim and defendant gender. In total, we had 235 participants in this study, both men and women. They were mostly white and aged 18 to 83. To conduct this study, we employed a 2 victim gender by 2 defendant gender by 2 participant gender between subjects design, so that participants were exposed to 1 of 4 conditions. These conditions were a same-sex male couple, a same-sex female couple, a heterosexual couple with a male victim, and a heterosexual couple with a female victim. The participants received a trial summary describing a case of spousal rape where the victim testified that their spouse raped them in a shared residence. The trial describes a date night between spouses where the defendant engaged in a forced act of sodomy with the victim. After the trial, the jurors rendered a verdict of guilty or not guilty. Then they rated their perceptions of the victim and defendant by reporting their score on a scale of 1 to 10 for variables rating their perception towards the victim and defendant, such as morality, credibility, blame, and believability. Therefore, let's talk more about our results. In order to analyze our data, we used logistic regressions to examine the impact of our independent variables on verdict, and a stepwise linear regression to investigate the impact of our predictors on other dependent rating variables, measuring perceptions of the defendant and victim. There was support for hypothesis 1 in this experiment. Women held more pro-victim attitudes than men, as we predicted. Specifically, women attributed higher scores of blame to the defendant than men in the trial, in turn supporting the victim more. Most significantly, hypothesis 2 was fully supported. As shown in figure 1, political orientation is a significant predictor of verdict. Self-identified liberal-leaning participants were more likely to render guilty verdicts than conservative participants. Across the 7 types of political orientation, there is variation in how jurors viewed the crime. For example, even within the liberal category, people who rated themselves as very liberal rendered more guilty verdicts than those who reported their beliefs as slightly liberal. Next, our exploratory analyses yielded interesting results. As shown in figure 2, we found that heterosexual spousal rape with a male victim is viewed as less severe than heterosexual spousal rape with a female victim and same-sex spousal rape overall. This means that in general, spousal rape is viewed similarly to most rape. However, when a wife rapes her husband, participants view this crime as significantly less severe, which is shown by the lower left data point on the graph in figure 2. Finally, our results indicated that jurors' ratings of defendant blame mediated the relationship between verdict and participant gender, offering insights into how jurors thought while they were reading the trial and rendering their verdict. So, for example, women attributed more blame to the defendant than men. Therefore, when women were asked to render a verdict, they rendered more guilty verdicts than men. In conclusion, this research yielded many significant results, finding support for both of my hypotheses, with women and liberal jurors having the more pro-victim attitudes than men and conservative jurors. On the other hand, in general, we did not find differences in the prosecution between same-sex and heterosexual couples. There are many possible explanations for this result. This is likely because overall, 77.9% of verdicts rendered in this trial were not guilty, regardless of condition or participant gender. So this means that because jurors typically regard spousal rape as wrong, but not rape, and believe that marriage implies continuous consent, gender across the experiment likely did not impact verdict due to a floor effect, which left few jurors unwilling to send someone to jail for the crime of rape within marriage, which may have limited our statistical significance. Additionally, expectations of gender stereotype were more salient than bias towards sexual orientation. Past research has shown that most people don't believe that it is possible for a man to be raped by a woman because it is inconsistent with societal expectations of rape victims to be, quote, feminine, weak, and defenseless. According to expectations of gender and sex, men are expected to welcome sex, so it is unfathomable to most jurors that a man would turn it down from his wife. In contrast, many people may believe that women would have more difficulty resisting a male perpetrator, as well as same-sex couples who are stereotyped to be more egalitarian in nature and may be seen as physically similar in size and strength. Of course, our study was not without limitations. For example, the verdicts rendered in this trial were based on individual juror judgments and not juror deliberation, as would be in a typical courtroom proceeding. Because there is no research regarding juror perceptions of same-sex spousal rape, this research serves as a starting point for future research studies. We hope that this research has other practical applications, like helping lawyers better serve their clients in a courtroom setting. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Yes, so I have a question about what the next steps are for this research. So first, we would like to begin the process of publication for this journal, but also there are a lot of future directions that we want to do to expand this study. So for example, we would like to correlate political ideology to beliefs of wrong but not rape judgment specifically to see if conservative jurors specifically cite the reasoning for not guilty verdicts to be wrong but not rape. Thank you for your question. Yeah, so we have a question about what steps did we take to protect the subjects to make sure that taking the study was not traumatic or difficult for them. So we had the participants signed an informed consent sheet before they began the study, which let them know that they were going to be reading about sexual violence. And so if they did not consent to reading about that, they definitely did not have to continue with the study. And then at the end of the study with our debriefing sheet, we also provided resources for participants who may have been affected negatively by reading this trial. Yes, we have another question about how maybe the self-selection process influenced findings, and that is another limitation of our study, is that we did not specifically ask our mock jurors to report their past history with sexual violence. So, for example, we might have had people who did have a past history of sexual violence opt out of the study, or people were really passionate about taking the study because of their past history. But typically in a voir dire process for juror selection, like in person for a real courtroom jury, they would probably not select a juror who does have a past history. So we think that for that reason, it is kind of one benefit of jurors kind of self-selecting to take the study or not. We have another question that says, did you do any historical research on how juries have decided on these cases and how that has changed over time? And yes, we did do some research with historical cases, and it is kind of difficult to do that for same-sex couples because technically we've only had approximately 5 to 7 years where same-sex couples can even be tried for spousal rape because of marriage equality passing in 2015. And additionally, the laws regarding spousal rape were not updated until very, very recently. So there's not a depth of literature with that kind of research. But we did do some basic exploratory research in that regard.
Okay, great job, Haley. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll move on to our next presenter. Do you want to go ahead and let's see if I can see if this will work this time. I don't understand why this is doing this. Oh my goodness.
Well, while we wait, I have a follow-up question, Haley, about since I'm the one who asked about the historical research. When did the laws change?
Yes. Okay. So in 1993, spousal rape was considered its own crime for the first time. Prior to that, spousal rape was not considered a crime federally. I think in some states it was. And I believe in 2017, the definition of spousal rape changed to be more gender inclusive and inclusive of all types of sexual kind of violence. So before 2017, spousal rape was only a crime if a man or a husband raped his wife. But the definition was updated to any gender of person raping any gender of person within the context of marriage. And it also was more expansive for the type of sexual violence that could be included. So in our case, it was a sodomy trial, which does fall under the definition of sexual or of spousal rape. So it is very, very recent that the laws regarding spousal rape have become more inclusive, but still to this day, states have really decreased sentences for spousal rape in comparison to stranger rape. So in South Carolina, for example, spousal rape has a maximum sentence of 10 years, whereas stranger rape could have a maximum sentence of 30 to 40 years. So it is really regarded as not as serious of a crime overall as stranger or acquaintance rape.
Thank you for that answer. That was very enlightening.
Thank you.
It's just not cooperating, is it, Abby?
No, no, it's not. Sorry, no, it's not. Eliot is up next to present her second one, but we may just have to go this way. Eliot, do you want to go ahead and just share your
I can do that.
share screen, your second presentation, and we'll just go from there. And I will continue to work on this. I truly apologize, guys. Carol, thank you for moderating this session also. I failed to mention that earlier.
Okay, so this is the right poster this time. Let me reintroduce myself. My name is Eliot Bradshaw, and I am in Dr. Jonathan Golding's Psychology and Law Lab. And right now I will be presenting my research on the influence of defendant tattoo placement and style on jury decision-making. First impressions are especially important when it comes to jury decision-making, and physical characteristics have been shown to influence jurors' decisions. Physical characteristics can include the juror's race or the defendant's race, whether they wear glasses or not, and whether they have tattoos. Tattoos have a negative connotation, and children as young as 6 years old have been shown to have that negative association between tattoos and deviance. The 19th century criminologist Cesare Lombroso was the first one to explicitly make this connection, and several of his stereotypes that he made still hold today. Tattoos are associated with alcohol and drug use, antisocial personality disorder, and promiscuity in women. Only 2 previous studies have investigated the influence of tattoos on jury decision-making. One of them found that facial tattoos do activate a criminal stereotype, and another found that tattoo style mattered, but location did not. The purpose of this present study is to determine how tattoos placement and style influences jury decision-making. We have 4 hypotheses. We predicted a main effect of tattoo placement so that defendants with a tattoo on the neck would be perceived more negatively than defendants with a tattoo on the arm. We also predicted a main effect of tattoo style so that defendants with aggressive tattoos would be perceived more negatively than those with passive tattoos. We predicted a main effect of the presence of a tattoo so that defendants with the tattoo would be perceived more negatively than those with no tattoo, i.e. the control group. And we also predicted a tattoo placement by tattoo style interaction so that passive tattoos would remain fairly constant in their ratings despite location, while aggressive tattoos would be perceived more negatively and lead to more guilty verdicts when on the neck as compared to the arm. We again recruited participants through Amazon's Mechanical Turk, and we ended up with 244 participants, 134 females and 108 males. And the design was a 2x2x2, where the levels of placement were on the arm or neck. The level of tattoo style was aggressive or passive, and the level of participant gender was male or female. And we also had the control group. As you can see in figure 1, the different aggressive and passive tattoos, we used a wolf and barbed wire for aggressive and a dolphin and yin yang for passive. And for the control group, we used red cowboy boots to identify the defendant. Participants were randomly assigned to one of the conditions and read a criminal assault mock trial summary in which the defendant was identified either with an aggressive, passive tattoo or red cowboy boots. And participants then responded to a series of questions about the defendant and victim, strength of each side, and then they gave their verdict and the reason for their verdict. As you can see in figure 2, unfortunately, our hypothesis was not supported and there was not a significant difference between verdicts in the neck condition and the arm condition. However, even though there was not a significant difference, the pattern of results was consistent with our hypothesis. Again, in figure 3, hypothesis 2 was not supported, but again, the pattern was consistent. Hypothesis 3 and 4 were also not supported, and there was not a significant main effect of tattoo presence compared to no tattoo, and there was also not a significant interaction. So even though the results for this study did not support our hypotheses, once again, the patterns were consistent with what we had predicted. It must be kept in mind that there were limitations to this research. And again, a limitation was that there was no jury deliberation because in a real setting, the jury members would have time to deliberate before giving their verdict. So there wasn't perfect external validity. And another limitation was that the control condition, the cowboy boots, were often mentioned in the reasoning for verdicts. And it seems that they were just as distinctive, if not more so, than the tattoos. And another limitation is that the images of the tattoos were presented just as you see on the screen, and that may not have the same effect as if the tattoos were actually presented on a person. In addition to dealing with these limitations, in the future, research could investigate the influence of gang or other organized crime tattoos on jurors. There is an artistic difference between criminal tattoos that are done in jail and the typical tattoos done at a tattoo parlor. So it would be interesting to see how exactly those specific designs vary, and investigating the influence of tattoos on female perpetrators as well on males, because even though tattoos are more common now, there's still more of a stigma for females than there is for males. And finally, another study could investigate the influence of tattoos on jury decision-making in different types of crime. Does it have to be a violent crime for the stereotype to be enacted, or does it work for any crime? That would be a really interesting question to examine. And thank you all for listening to my presentation, and I will open it up to any questions you all may have.
Eliot, I have a question about your research study, and since you didn't get the results you were expecting, how would you go back if you had to do it all over again? How would you alter your study to have maybe more conclusive results?
One thing I would definitely do are kind of the things I addressed in the limitations section. We chose red cowboy boots because we wanted the control to be memorable, but it seems that it was almost too memorable. And so I would probably change that to something a little less noticeable than red cowboy boots and something a little more normal, like there would be in everyday life. Also, I would probably work on my Photoshop skills so I could actually put those tattoos on pictures of people. That was kind of our issue with just having the flat tattoos instead of on a person, because it's one thing to see a tattoo picture, but it's another to see it on someone's neck or on their arm. And so just kind of addressing those limitations is something that I would really want to do in the future.
That would also give you a sense of scale too. Like if it's a large tattoo, that might make a difference as well compared to a very small one.
Yes, it's very different to just see like a small little barbed wire on someone's arm or seeing it take up their entire upper arm. And so I think that could make a big difference in the results.
Really interesting research.
Thank you.
It is very interesting, Eliot. You know, every tattoo supposedly has a story. I work with my part-time job. I work with folks who have a lot of tattoos, and I always ask them about it. And so it's interesting to find out. So that might be something that could be looked at in the future too, to see, you know, how and when and why maybe these tattoos are developed, created, you know, imprinted, because it may have something to do with nothing to do with the criminal aspect of the person, or, you know, just interesting. I find it interesting, the stories that I hear.
Yes, it's very interesting. And one of the things about prison tattoos is that they usually do have prison imagery. So they usually have something to do with justice, or they have some recognition of a gang or anything that happens within the prison. And so that's where you get the stereotypical teardrop tattoos for either prison sentences served or for number of people that they have killed. And so it's just very interesting to compare strictly prison related tattoos as compared to aggressive tattoos, because they're not necessarily the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I look like I have a question. What was the most important issue you personally learned from this research? As far as the actual methodology goes, it's that small things can make a big difference in a study. So like I was talking about those limitations. Before the study, it didn't necessarily seem like it would make that much of a difference, but it could end up being a significant difference in the results. And as far as the material goes, it was just very interesting to learn about the different types and different kind of classes of tattoos. I don't have any tattoos, and so I hadn't really known much about the world of tattoo art, but there are actually kind of 4 different classes of tattoos. There's prison, there's street, there's professional, and there's semi-professional, and they all have different kind of artistic qualities, and the design is different. For example, in prison, they're normally done on the hands or face, which is why you see that so much. And that's because it's easy for the prisoners to tattoo themselves there. And they're kind of the more simple designs because it's usually kind of homemade machinery as compared to the professional and semi-professional, which are actual tattoo machines made for that use.
Well, I learned something just now.
There is a whole lot of information about tattoos out there, but there is still not very much research about them in the courtroom. And so I think there will definitely be a lot more of this research coming in the future.
Great job, Eliot.
Thank you.
Any more questions for Eliot?
Abby, we have a question that didn't get answered that was for Haley.
Oh, I see that now. The one on why do you think there are no studies on queer martial rape? Was that it?
Yeah.
I think I kind of addressed this very, very briefly in my presentation, but one of the reasons that there isn't a lot of research on this topic is because it is very new. Like I mentioned, I mean, only since 2015 could a same-sex spousal couple even prosecute in the courtroom under the definition of spousal rape. So I think that it just isn't a widely studied topic because there hasn't been much time to study it. But I think that as we progress in the future, and I mean, hopefully there aren't very many cases that are prosecuted in the courtroom, but just with time, that's bound to be the situation. I think that there will be an increasing number of studies looking at same-sex rape in a spousal context.
Thank you. Okay. Our next presenter, and I'm not going to even try to bring these slides up, so I will just read the slide. Our next presenter is Kelsey Naylor. Kelsey also works under the direction of Dr. Jonathan Golding in the psychology department. And the title of her research is The Impact of Victim Drug Use on Legal Decision Making During a Rape Trial. Kelsey, are you ready to present?
I am, yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelsey Naylor, and my mentor for this project was Dr. Jonathan Golding. The title of my research is The Impact of Victim Drug Use on Legal Decision-Making During a Rape Trial. So one big issue for females in the United States is sexual assault, and 9 out of every 10 victims are female. And there's a high rate of these sexual assaults that involve drugs, whether it's the perpetrator or it's the victim. Current research on drugs in the courtroom primarily revolves around alcohol and Rohypnol, as Ellie had talked about earlier. Rohypnol is a date rape drug. And these studies have shown about these 2 drugs that when a victim is intoxicated at the time of the rape, she is seen as less credible. This was viewed for both police officers in a study done and also for jurors. Additionally, it's been found that females perceive a rape victim as more credible than males. So our hypotheses for this research is that the stimulant drug, which I chose as Adderall, would be associated with the highest number of guilty verdicts. And research has shown that Adderall improves your memory. So this was our thinking behind making this first hypothesis. And also our hallucinogenic drug chosen, which was LSD, would be associated with the least number of guilty verdicts. And this is due to the drug involving hallucinations. Our second hypothesis was that female participants would be more pro-victim than the male participants. And this means that female participants would make more guilty verdicts. They'd have higher ratings of victim sympathy, etc. The participants chosen for this study were 100 students that were recruited from UK, and there were 21 males and 79 females. The design of the study was a 6x2 mixed factor design. There were 6 levels of drugs, and we separated participant sex into male and female. So each drug that we chose represented a different prototypic drug of 5 different categories. For alcohol, we chose beer. For hallucinogenic, we chose LSD. For the opioid, we chose heroin. Marijuana was in a category of its own, and a stimulant was Adderall. And our control was no drug at all. So each participant read 6 different trial summaries, and all of these trial summaries consisted of a description of where and when the rape occurred, how the victim and the defendant met, what type of drug the victim had ingested, a description of the victim's condition after she had ingested the drug, and a description of the victim, of what the victim and defendant said occurred after leaving the party, and juror instructions by a judge. After reading each trial summary, Participants were asked to answer a few trial questions, which included guilty or not guilty verdicts, why they made that decision of guilty or not guilty, victims' credibility and sympathy, along with the defendant's credibility, and the victim's ability to consent, whether or not the victim did consent, and the extent of her memory. So the hypotheses, the results of our first hypothesis, which was the drug type, we found that juror verdict did not yield significant effects of drug type, and that is shown in figure 2 below. However, we did run a few other ANOVA analyses that did yield significant effects of drug type, which included victim credibility, sympathy toward the victim, the extent to which the victim could consent, and also victim memory. Our second hypothesis was very similar to our first hypothesis in that there was no significant difference in verdict between male and female participants, but we did find that there were significant differences with the jurors' ratings of the victim credibility and sympathy toward the victim. The first figure shows the interaction between the drug type and participant sex. This simply means that the verdict for drug was affected by the sex of the participant. And as you can see, the LSD and beer verdict had the same mean and standard deviation. And Adderall and heroin, which is the green and red line, also had the same mean and standard deviation. So overall, we did have a few limitations of our study, which was that we did a within subject design. This means that each participant had to read the 6 trials in one sitting, which could have caused them, as they kept reading, to judge the drugs in the same way. A second limitation was that all of our participants came from the University of Kentucky, which means that the results cannot be generalized to the entire population. However, this study does show that there are future directions in which we could go. One of the main ones that I think would be interesting would be giving this to the community and seeing whether there is an age difference of the participant on victim drug use, on legal decision making, because I believe that older generations might view drugs differently than younger generations. And this research does have further implications, and it could be used by prosecutors and lawyers when they are considering different jurors to select for rape trials. That is all for my presentation, and I am ready for any questions that anyone has. I do see a question in the chat, and it says, did participants have the option to self-identify as trans, non-binary, or gender non-conforming? So the way we asked for participants' sex was their sex that was assigned at birth. So they did not have the option of choosing their gender, but this was just to ensure that we only had a 6x2 design. But I think that would be a good future direction for research, seeing the difference between genders and not just participant sex.
So you had quite a smaller number of males than you did females. Do you think that contributed at all to the results and the outcome of your study?
I do think it could have contributed a little bit, but we did have enough males that I don't believe it would have made too large of a difference. One thing that I did really enjoy about this research was seeing that there wasn't a significant difference between male and female verdicts, which shows a little bit that males don't quite hold the stigma of victim drug use and rape trials as they had probably before. So this could be due to the environment which they grew up in, or it could just be education because they are college students. I think you are muted.
Of course, had to do that. Do you have any plans to continue this research?
As of right now, I don't have any plans, but it's definitely not off the table to continue this research because this is a topic I'm very passionate about, and it's such a large issue for females in America.
Very nice presentation, Kelsey. Any more questions for Kelsey before we move on? Okay. Our next presenter will be Sarah Ross. Sarah's title of her research is Race Crime Congruency Effect on Drug Trafficking Cases in the Courtroom. Sarah, are you ready?
Yes, I am all set. Okay. Let's do. Okay, does that look good? Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Sarah Ross, and with the help of Dr. Jonathan Golding, today I will be presenting on my research on the race crime congruency effect on drug trafficking cases in the courtroom. So years ago, social psychologists reported a juror decision-making bias called the race crime congruency effect. This is a tendency to associate and negatively perceive Black men more than white men for stereotypical Black crimes, but then do the opposite for the stereotypical white crimes. Previous research examined this effect looking at white-collar crime versus traditional street crime. They specifically used auto theft as a stereotypical Black crime compared to embezzlement as the stereotypical white crime. Instead of focusing on the traditional street crime versus white-collar crime approach, I was curious about how this effect might have a role in drug offense cases and how specific drug types might be associated with certain races, therefore displaying the stereotypical congruency's influence on juror decision-making. Excuse me. Using a within subjects designed questionnaire, participants were asked about how they view defendants charged with either marijuana, pain pills, or crack cocaine drug trafficking charges. After studying some historical context and previously found research on drug and race associations, we formed 4 different hypotheses. For the first hypothesis, we predicted a main effect of defendant race, where Black defendants will be judged more harshly than the white defendants for all 3 types of drugs. For our second hypothesis, we predicted another main effect of drug type, where out of all 3 drug types, crack cocaine would receive the harshest judgments, pain pills would receive the second harshest, and finally marijuana would receive the least harsh out of all 3. Thirdly, we hypothesized an in-between subjects main effect of participant gender, where female participants would display fewer negative perceptions in comparison to the male participants. For the last hypothesis, a drug type and defendant race interaction was predicted, where the most negative perceptions would be found in the Black defendant and crack cocaine condition. To test these hypotheses, 105 undergraduate students participated in a Qualtrics survey. 82.8% of those participants were female and 17.1% of those participants were male. Out of all the participants as well, 81.9% were white, 13% were Black, 5.7% were Asian, 3.8% were Hispanic, and 2.8% were Middle Eastern. Using a 2x3x2 mixed factor design, I varied the race of the defendant and the different drug types. Gender was the in-between subjects independent variable. 6 scenarios were presented to the participants, and after they read each one, they were asked a series of questions targeted to examine their perceptions toward the defendants, as well as their perceptions toward each drug trafficking offense. The questions asked the participants to determine a verdict, rate the severity of the crime, rate how much of a threat that particular defendant is, as well as what the likelihood of recidivism is for that particular defendant. To analyze and interpret our results, we ran a series of ANOVAs through SPSS. We found no supporting evidence for 1, 3, and 4, hypothesis 1, 3, and 4, which predicted main effects of participant gender and race, as well as an interaction between race and drug type. Supporting evidence was discovered for our second hypothesis, which predicted a main effect of drug type, where out of all 3 drug types, crack cocaine would receive the harshest judgments, pain pills would receive the second harshest, and finally marijuana receiving the least harsh out of the 3. For all the variables tested, this hypothesis was supported. So if you look at the tables, each variable's mean distribution is displayed with each drug type. Along the x-axis are the drug types. Marijuana is the one furthest on the left. Pain pills are the ones in the middle, and crack cocaine is on the right side. So you can see that this predicted main effect is noticeable in all 5 variables, with each drug type increasing as you move from left to right. On top of discovering the supporting evidence for hypothesis 2, we discovered a post hoc interaction between participant gender and race. We found that when it comes to perceptions of severity of crime, males and females differed when they are rating the white defendants. For the white defendant conditions, males judged the defendants less negatively than the females judged the white defendants. For females, there was no difference between the white and black defendants when it comes to their judgment levels. So on the graph, if you look at the red line in particular, that represents the ratings for the white defendants. Along the x-axis, female ratings of the severity levels plotted on the left side. It's a little small, but I hope you can see it, is on the left side, and then the male ratings are on the right side. So that downward slope displays where the gender difference is within the severity ratings. There is also a similar interaction with marginal significance in the likelihood of committing a future crime variable. Limitations for the study, as most studies have, includes participant demographics, specifically regarding gender. The gender distribution was 82.8% females and 17.1% males. More male participation would even out that gender distribution a little more. Also, race distribution of the participants was leaning more on the white side, and evening that out and adding more racial representation would diversify the participant pool and represent more of the general population. The participants were also undergraduate students instead of external community members, making the results less generalizable and representative. Also including visual cues and presenting a full-length trial, but also better the study to present the cases in a more realistic and palpable way. All in all, this study aimed to look beyond the traditional street crime versus white collar crime, race crime congruency effect research by exploring this effect's potential role in drug trafficking offenses. Future research could explore how the race crime congruency effect might be impacting or not impacting juror decision-making and other types of criminal offenses outside of embezzlement and theft-related crimes. Although the interaction between the race and the drug type was not discovered in the results, we did find significant support for how different drug types affects juror perceptions of the defendants. We also discovered the significant exploratory findings with the race and gender interaction for juror perceptions towards the white defendants. And that is the overall little spiel about my research. Thank you so much for being here and listening. Let's go ahead and open it up to questions.
Sarah, it's such interesting research. Were you surprised by how women perceived racial demographics in terms of drug use?
I was actually, because we weren't necessarily examining that particular interaction, that wasn't listed like in our hypotheses, I was surprised just in general that we found something outside of the drug related premise. And so that would be a really cool future direction of looking at how gender might impact how females in comparison to males or non-binary or other genders and how they view white defendants in comparison to also Black defendants as well. So I was a little surprised. It was a really interesting find for sure.
Are you planning to continue this research?
So I will actually be going to graduate school for forensic and legal psychology. And I am interested in possibly partaking in some kind of research over there. So, and I'm also very passionate about racial bias in the courtroom. And so I want to continue to learn through research, probably in graduate school, but it's also up in the air and we'll see, but I'm very interested in this subject.
Well, congratulations, Sarah. Can you share with us where you're going to grad school?
Marymount University in DC.
Nice. Is that close to home or no?
I'm from Atlanta, so not really. But I'm excited.
Absolutely.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any other questions for Sarah?
I have one more question, Evie, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
And Sarah, so with two of the different drugs that you chose, so pain pills can be legally prescribed, and also marijuana is, increasingly legal in many parts of the country. So do you feel that perceptions of being less than crack cocaine, which is very illegal in all circumstances, do you think that led to any of the perceptions or findings in your study?
That's a great question. I think if you look at the demographics as well of the participants, they're undergraduate students. So I think age impacts the perception as well as like the legal status or whether or not it can be like prescribed as well. So I think that yes, that definitely will impact the overall, I think, perceptions toward those actual drugs. And I also think age factors into those perceptions that corresponds with the legal status, as well as like it being prescribed. So yes.
All right. Well, great presentation. Thank you so much. And congratulations and good luck in grad school.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So our next presenter is Jaclyn Jamison. Jaclyn is going to present on the effect of multiple victims on juror participants in child sexual assault cases. Jaclyn, are you ready to present?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Okay, can you see my?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Hi, my name is Jaclyn Jamison, and my research is under the Dr. Golding, and the title of my presentation is The Effect of Multiple Victims on Juror Perceptions in Child Sexual Assault Cases. In the United States, 26.6% of girls and 5.1% of boys report experiencing sexual assault in their lifetime. So these children rely on the criminal justice system to help them obtain justice. However, a problem with our current system is that jurors enter the courtrooms with their own set of qualities, experiences, and biases that all influence how they're going to perceive the law. And additionally, when this is paired with how men and women are more skeptical of child sexual assault cases than other types of cases, it's important to conduct research on how jurors make decisions and perceive victims from a legal perspective. There's been a lot of research looking at different variables in child sexual assault cases and how jurors perceive these cases, but there's been limited research on how multiple victims of the same sexual abuser affect juror decision making. So the purpose of this study is to investigate the effect the number of victims and the age of the victims have on mock juror perceptions of a child sexual assault case. So I have 3 hypotheses for this, and the first one is that there would be a main effect of participant gender, where females should produce more pro-victim judgments and guilty verdicts than males. The second hypothesis is a main effect of the number of victims, where 2 victims should produce more guilty verdicts overall than 1 victim. And the third hypothesis predicts an interaction between the age of victim 1 and the age of victim 2, such that more pro-victim results will occur when the 6-year-old is presented first and the 15-year-old second, as opposed to the 15-year-old first and the 6-year-old second. 83 community members took part in this study that were recruited through Mechanical Turk, and there were a large proportion of females to males. This study used a 2 age of victim 1 being 6 or 15 by 2 age of victim 2 being 6 or 15 by 2 participant gender, male or female, between participants designed with 2 control conditions that were a 6-year-old only and a 15-year-old only. The materials in this study included a trial summary of a fictional first-degree rape trial that describes a defendant allegedly having forcible and non-consensual intercourse with either one girl aged 6 or 15 or 2 young girls aged 6 and or 15, the attacks occurring 1 month apart in the latter cases. After reading the trial summary, participants rendered a verdict and answered a series of questions about their perceptions of the victims and defendant. The results overall for participant gender were mostly non-significant. However, participant gender and victim sympathy was significant, where females were more sympathetic towards the victims than males. Additionally, I want to note that the verdict and victim believability both displayed a trending effect for participant gender, meaning females tended to have more guilty verdicts than males and were more likely to believe the victim. The results of the number of victims was also non-significant, but the sympathy rating showed a trending effect, meaning that participants tended to feel worse when the second victim was present. The results of the third hypothesis were non-significant, but we found some significant results in terms of age effect. For example, the age of victim 1 in verdict was significant, meaning 6-year-olds produced more guilty verdicts than 15-year-olds, which is displayed in figure 1. The age of victim 1 was also significant for victim sympathy and believability, indicating participants were more sympathetic towards 6-year-olds and believed 6-year-olds more often than 15-year-olds, which is displayed in figure 2. There was also a trending effect for victim credibility, meaning participants tended to believe 6-year-olds more often than 15-year-olds. Overall, the purpose of the study was to investigate how multiple child victims in the same sexual assault case influenced juror perceptions of that case. Although most of the analyses were statistically not significant, the pattern was consistent with my hypotheses. For example, females tended to make more pro-victim judgments than males in some cases, and also younger victims were believed slightly more often and perceived as more credible than older victims. The finding of the number of victims and sympathy is new, and where the presence of a second victim might make participants feel worse for the victims. This study was limited by the sample size being small and the larger proportion of females than males, making the findings hard to generalize. Furthermore, not as many participants rendered a guilty verdict as in previous research. So in the future, I would like to run more participants with this study to see if the trending effects turn out, and also in the future, I think it would be interesting because in my study, the two testimonies of the young girls were the same. I would like to see if the testimonies were a little different in their stories, if what effect this would have on juror perceptions. And as a result of this study, we now understand more about juror perceptions in child sexual assault cases with multiple victims. Knowing this can help law enforcement officials understand how a jury might respond to the situation. And when previous research has shown that adults have a hard time discerning child testimony, this research could help this effect because it shows that the presence of a second victim might help to increase pro-victim judgments. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I will take any questions now.
Hey, Jaclyn, since you are the last of this group, the Professor Golding's group, I have a question. It seems like some of you are choosing to do a Qualtrics survey for undergraduates, and then others are going with Mechanical Turk. So what were the decisions that you made to decide which way to pursue your study?
For me, I wanted Mechanical Turk because it would be it would be able to generalize more to the population since it comes from community members, and I would have more diversity within the subjects. So I chose to go that route. I know like access to UK students is pretty easy, so that's also like a great route to go if you want like easy access to participants. So I think it just depends on what you want for your study and what you're looking for. But for me, Mechanical Turk definitely was more helpful.
That makes sense with the type of study you're going for. Do you plan to continue this research?
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, like we didn't have that many like subjects in this study. So we actually did run a few more subjects like after I had to turn this project in just to see what was happening. And like preliminarily, we found that like some support for my hypotheses and how like verdicts decreased when you had a 15-year-old present, especially if that 15-year-old was presented first. The verdicts decreased drastically, no matter what, if you had a 15-year-old or a 6-year-old second. So, which basically shows that you're pretty much kind of screwed if you don't have a 6-year-old first or a younger victim first, because you're less likely to believe even the second victim, no matter if it's a 6-year-old or a 15-year-old, if you have that younger victim second. So it's much more advantageous for the lawyer presenting the case to have the younger victims presented first rather than second.
It seems as if the jury has already made their decision before they've heard the entirety of the case.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm reading that.
Yeah, because for ours, like for the first victim, you could say guilty or not guilty. And for the second victim, you could say guilty or not guilty. But participants, whatever they said for the first victim, they said for the second victim. So whatever they've already decided, they're going to say the same thing throughout the case and keep it consistent, which is pretty interesting. They're not like taking the cases separately. They're kind of combining them together.
Do we have any other questions from any other attendees? Just type them in the chat. Such a difficult subject. Your class had all very difficult subjects.
Yeah.
How did you approach this as a class to work through any issues that might come up? You all had really difficult topics.
Yeah, we all definitely had difficult topics and a lot of like trigger warning topics. And I think like being in a class together, having Zoom every week helped us a lot to discuss our thoughts and feelings on the subject and like kind of bounce ideas off each other. So it was really helpful to interact with each other and just like be there for each other whenever things were getting hard with our projects. We all kind of realized that we were in this together and on the same boat. So that I think really helped.
Does anyone else in the group want to comment on that?
I think the toughest part for me, at least, was last semester developing our introduction or proposal itself, because that required a lot of critical thinking. And so getting a lot of help from peers in our class. We would have class every Tuesday and Thursday, and getting support and recommendations on how to find articles, how to find more information on our topic was really helpful. And I also got to learn about their research and their interests as well and expand my knowledge on different areas of psychology and psychology research. So I think especially last semester, we received a lot of help from our classmates. And this semester, I know I personally, when it comes to interpreting and going through statistical analysis, while also having support by Dr. Brown, Dr. Golding also went out of his way to have individual meetings and work through the results with us and help interpret the data. So I really think we couldn't have done it without him or Dr. Brown or Dr. Farr. They all were incredibly helpful and supportive through this whole process.
Very nice, ladies. We have one last presentation in this session. Any other comments, questions before we move to our last panelist? Okay. Well, next, I would like to welcome Madeline Williams. Madeline, are you ready to present?
Yes, I am. Can you all see my my presentation slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll go ahead and get started, as I am I'm pretty sure the last person in this this track of people. But I studied loneliness during mass social distancing during the summer of 2020 as the culmination of my honors thesis work. And so to give you some theoretical background on what's going on in loneliness, there are 4 major academic understandings, but we're really only going to focus on 2 in this presentation, which is the Archibald and Weiss understanding that loneliness is due to a lack of physical contact or social interaction with people, versus the cognitive discrepancy model, which basically argues that loneliness is due to a comparison between relationships. So I'm lonely because I don't have the relationship that you have, and I would like that relationship. I also looked at stress proliferation, basically the idea that one stressor in culmination with other stressors causes a larger feeling of stress. And I also looked at interpersonal relationships and the stability and strength of online relationships. In terms of methodology, I had 16 participants that were randomly recruited through public university related platforms. They all participated in interviews and also utilized the UCLA loneliness scale, which is a scale used most often in loneliness data to quantify loneliness. I took that scale data in conjunction with the qualitative coding of my interviews to better understand what was going on. In terms of results, here is my UCLA loneliness scale data. And so as you can tell, I have not a whole lot of participants, mostly because I was running this study alone. And so interviewing and having scale data for more than 16 participants wasn't something that I was really able to do. But the most important thing to take away from my data is the fact that I had an average scale score of a 50.56 in comparison to previous national studies of the same age group from 18 to 25-year-olds, which was a 47.87. So to give you an idea, the scale is relative, but basically the higher the score, the higher the loneliness, basically. And so as we can tell, the people in my group had a higher average scale score than previous studies. Now, I cannot generalize this to UK, let alone the world generally, but it does indicate that more research is needed because of the slightly higher scale score for my participants. In terms of defining and understanding loneliness, my participants kind of more sided with the idea that loneliness was more of a physical lack of social interactions with people as opposed to having different relationships that they would like and comparing them to others. I kind of understand this to probably be because most people had similar types of relationships or similar social relationship status during COVID-19 because we were all stuck inside. A lot of people had a very difficult time understanding and explaining their experience of loneliness to me. There were a lot of pauses and a lot of ums and trying to figure it out and talking through it, even though they preemptively knew what the interview was going to be about. A very interesting definition of loneliness that I found is that a lot of people talk about loneliness as an experience with oneself, as opposed to our previous understandings of loneliness as an experience without other people. And so I think that's important to highlight there. In terms of social stress theory, we can all agree that the pandemic is a large stressor all by itself, and in conjunction with non-pandemic related stressors and a lot of the consequences that came with the pandemic, it caused a larger feeling of stress in a lot of my participants, and also noted kind of the self-perpetuating cycle of stress, poor mental health, and loneliness. In terms of interpersonal relationships, as I found that a lot of the quality of relationships online were hampered by the online format, and a lot of people have had a difficult time understanding the idea of, is someone available? Because they're tweeting on Twitter, does that mean I can call them? Because they're playing video games, are they available for me to talk to them? And it also touched on masculinity, in which I have a whole other paper for and cannot go into in this presentation, but is really interesting influence on loneliness. The idea of social blinders is kind of this idea that I've proposed, that a lot of people lack context in social interactions online, so they don't see body language, they can't understand tone, they can't see facial expressions, and that really makes it difficult to understand what's going on. And in conjunction with that, a lot of people felt that there was a lack of stability in their online relationships because of the fact that people could log off at any time, people could just leave, a Zoom chat could fail, your internet could fail, and so it's not as stable as a face-to-face relationship. So in conclusion, I definitely have personal ties to the research. I technically qualify for the research. I am a university student between the ages of 18 to 25. In terms of limitation, I did run this study by myself with the help of my honors thesis advisor, but I am limited to what I was able to do. So I had 16 participants and I had to transcribe and analyze and work with all of that data by myself. And so to give you an idea, loneliness is not just a mental health problem. Loneliness is also a physical health problem. There are studies that show that chronic loneliness in young adults actually leads to heart issues later in life. And a lot of these solutions that people have previously proposed definitely don't work in our current environment, as they are not COVID friendly. And so some solutions that I would propose specifically to UK in particular is the idea that the counseling center could implement kind of group activities or group community situations that help lonely people find other lonely people to understand that you are in theory not alone and that there are other people that feel the same way, and to help build communities around that, because I think that's what a lot of people are lacking in this time period. And so I think the most important part of my presentation today is the fact that loneliness is here to stay. It existed before the pandemic, it existed especially during the pandemic, and it will continue to persist afterwards. And so it's important to continue studying and coming up with solutions to this problem. And that is the end of my presentation.
And Madeline, I would just like to share that I failed to say you actually were working with Lauren Cagle. Is that correct? In writing rhetoric and digital studies.
Yes, I work with Dr. Cagle, who's my thesis advisor, though the topic is more into sociology, which is what I am majoring in.
And Professor Cagle has a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. So she asks how I plan on carrying this research topic and experience forward into other projects. I am very invested in mental health work and social psychology generally. And as I described earlier, I did do a little bit of kind of work on masculinity and loneliness, and that's definitely something that I would like to work on in the future. And this topic generally is something that I would like to work on when I eventually apply to grad school. Haley asks, can you briefly explain how masculinity is tied to online availability? So So basically, just a brief explanation of what is in a whole other paper is that masculinity, as we understand it, hegemonic masculinity basically understands men to have characteristics such as being very assertive in conversations and social interactions, being independent. And that's something that I found was very different in conjunction with loneliness. A lot of men in terms of availability, but like, I don't want to be in people's space. I don't want to mess with them. I don't want to, enlarge on their area. If they're, online, I don't know if that means that I'm allowed to talk to them, and I don't want to try, which is very different than what we would normally assume with the idea of hegemonic masculinity. We would assume that men would be more likely to talk to people who are busy regardless of what they think they're doing, or are more likely to barge in and be in the way. But instead, a lot of men are very much like, I want to give people space. I don't want to be in the way. And so I think that's a very interesting finding.
Madeline, we hear a lot about introverts versus extroverts, and I know your research was limited in how many people that you talked with. Would introvert and extroversion play into the factor of loneliness for your research?
I mean, so there definitely is a difference. I personally did not study personality in conjunction with loneliness. There are previous studies that go along those lines. I would definitely say being an extrovert does not prevent you from being lonely. If anything, during COVID, especially when we were socially isolated, I think that it would make it worse. But also, that doesn't necessarily say that introverted people weren't lonely. There are plenty of people that who I talked to who were like, I enjoy being by myself a lot and being alone, but they were still severely impacted by the pandemic. They described situations of like wishing they could have similar events such as their previous relationships, even if it was a small group gathering that they preferred. They still missed that element of social interaction. And so, I think that there is kind of, potentially an influence, but I don't necessarily think that one being introverted versus being extroverted really impacts whether or not you are lonely.
All right, well done, Madeline. Does anyone have any other questions for Madeline before we wrap up this session? We have about 1 minute. Well, I would just like to say thank you to all the student presenters, and thank you to all the faculty mentors. Carol, thank you for helping to moderate this session. Very interesting topics. And as Carol said, very difficult topics to study and to articulate through. So thank you for your ability to do that. And good luck with the rest of your semester. We just have a few more days. And for those of you graduating, Godspeed to you and to your future endeavors.